President, there certainly is a lot of discussion, and understandably so, about the fact that so often there really aren't bipartisan efforts here in the United States Senate on major issues. You can turn on practically any talk show in America, and the constant refrain is, they're just not working together down there. The Democrats and Republicans can't find common ground, and in many instances aren't even trying. The issue that's before the Senate right now shows that that's certainly not the case. We all understand how important this immigration issue is. It's an economic issue. It's a justice issue. It affects scores and scores of communities across the country. And for many months now, here in the Senate, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, hour after hour after hour, have sought to come together in a bipartisan way to tackle a major issue. Now, I certainly don't support every single provision in the bill, and I'm sure that's the case for most senators. But I think that in terms of its large implications, this is an extraordinarily important effort. The immigration system is broken. Our country knows that it needs to be fixed. And what this shows is you can find some common ground, really address principled bipartisanship, not just bipartisanship for the sake of patting yourself on the back, but bipartisanship in terms of actually showing that values that are important to both sides of the aisle can be addressed, and at the same time the Senate can come together, work together, and in fact pass a law, actually succeed in the business that we're sent here to do, which is to pass legislation. I particularly want to commend 3 on our side of the aisle who I have worked with on these and many other issues: Chairman Leahy, Senator Schumer, and of course our majority leader. They have constantly put the focus on trying to show that senators are going to have a chance to be heard on this issue. We've had a lot of debate on it. They had literally scores and scores of amendments in the Judiciary Committee. We've had a lot of debate here on the floor of the United States Senate. And Chairman Leahy, Senator Schumer, Senator Reid have all indicated that senators are going to have an extensive opportunity to be heard. But yes, when there is a bipartisan bill produced by 4 Democratic leaders and 4 Republican leaders, those 3 have been resolute in saying that we're actually going to get it in front of the Senate, and I commend them for their very important work. Now, in addition to making it clear that I think bipartisanship is valuable, I do want to highlight for a moment 3 amendments that I hope I will be able to make pending and that we'll be able to get votes on. And in particular, I'm troubled by the fact that the bill as written waives our country's environmental laws in order to secure the border. And I'm of the view that strengthening our immigration system should not come at the cost of throwing our environmental laws aside. These are bedrock principles with respect to protecting our environment, our public lands, and our natural resources. And I and 7 other colleagues here in the Senate have introduced an amendment that would strike several of the unnecessary provisions in the bill that thwart the rule of law and ensure, as we go forward with a very important security agenda and securing the border, that, as I've indicated, we don't do long-term damage to our environment that may take generations to recover from, if at all. You know, if you're talking about waiving the laws that protect our public resources, and I know the distinguished president of the Senate cares a great deal about these issues, you ought to waive those laws only where there is compelling evidence that it's necessary, and even then it ought to be done in a narrow and targeted way. So my first amendment that I hope I'll be able to get pending and hope to be able to offer, Mr. President, is Amendment 1543. It would allow the Secretary of Homeland Security to work with the Department of Interior and Department of Agriculture, local landowners, state and Indian tribes to determine if any negative impacts can be mitigated. This means that if, in order to secure the border, there is damage to important environmental concerns, private property, public lands, tribal lands, the Secretary could take action to reduce that damage. So if, for example, the wall along the border causes unintended flooding in a city, the Secretary would be able to look at measures such as new infrastructure, dikes, or drainage systems to prevent flooding. If a road has to be built through a wetland or the habitat of an endangered species, the Secretary would have the authority to restore wetlands or conserve habitat for the species elsewhere. And all I want understood, Mr. President, is that the Department has testified, the Secretary Napolitano, has testified several times before the Congress, including recent testimony before the Judiciary Committee, that the Department of Homeland Security does not need these blanket authorities to waive the environmental laws. They have not requested blanket authority, Mr. President, to waive the environmental laws. And I think the Secretary's view in this regard speaks volumes as the need to carefully review legislation does, so as to make sure that when you're talking about a matter of such enormous concern and really also setting a precedent, Mr. President, that we think through how to ensure that we provide the security that the American people want, and at the same time, if we're talking about waiving environmental laws, at least we provide the authority to the Department to mitigate the damages in doing that, particularly given the fact that the Department has not sought the authority in the first place. They didn't seek the authority in the first place. Let's at least give them the authority to mitigate the damages. Now, another amendment that I seek to offer is Amendment 1544. That would simply sunset the provision to waive the environmental laws when what's called the second trigger in the legislation is met, and there has been considerable interest in the committee with respect to sunset authority and provision to do that. In one additional area, I think we ought to make sure that we sunset the provision to waive the environmental laws when the second trigger is met. And finally, I hope to be able to offer Amendment 1545, which creates a definition for physical, tactical infrastructure in the waiver of all the environmental laws. The amendment would define it as roads, vehicles, and pedestrian fences, port of entry barriers, lights, bridges, and towers for technology and surveillance. So again, what we're talking about, Mr. President, is not getting rid of the waiver. I understand that that isn't going to happen. But let's at least mitigate these damages that I think are a very real threat, and let us set forward some unambiguous terms that relate to how this waiver is going to be used. These are amendments, in my view, that improve the bill, Mr. President. They don't take away any of the authorities that are granted in this bill, but they are going to ensure that private property, public lands, our environmental values are also going to be a priority while allowing the border to be secured as quickly as possible. So, Mr. President, in wrapping up, let me say again, for all those who may be following this debate and have been skeptical about whether there was enough goodwill to do anything bipartisan, here, I think the United States Senate, in a bipartisan way, with a pretty significant vote, next week, I will not join the parlor debates about speculating about how many senators will vote for the bill, but I believe it is going to be a very substantial majority. It will, in fact, be a bipartisan law that is passed that responds to a significant issue, not just some kind of issue du jour that may have come up in the last few days and all of a sudden a few senators get interested and we come to the floor. This is a major substantive issue that has gone on and has been tackled in a bipartisan way, first by 8 senators willing to stick their neck out and get a fair amount of flack, as you invariably do when you try to work on a bipartisan issue in a bipartisan way, but also to acknowledge, particularly on our side of the aisle, Chairman Leahy, Senator Schumer, and Leader Reid, who have really tirelessly focused on trying to make sure that senators would have a chance to be heard and have done so. And I commend them for that effort and only conclude today by way of saying, Mr. President, I think the 3 amendments that I seek to make pending and get votes on will deal with another important issue. The bill, as written, waives the environmental laws in order to secure the border, and I and a number of other senators would like, at a minimum, to make sure that the Department of Homeland Security has the legal authority to mitigate the damage associated with that waiver wherever possible. And we think it is particularly important that those provisions that would mitigate the damages be allowed, since the Secretary has actually testified she doesn't need those authorities in the first place. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. And I note the absence of quorum.